Hi everyone, just going to talk you through my final year portfolio, well not portfolio, my final year project. So this was based on the harbour in Newcastle. It was sort of a technological research lab focused on algae, utilising that sort of resource that can be found abundantly to develop new materials. So the idea was to reduce plastic waste by researching and developing substitutes on this sort of site by the sea. And then this continued sort of a long history of industrial innovation along the coastline. That was sort of my initial route in to the brief, looking at sort of mining heritage and that sort of thing, and thinking about what would be the next sort of industrial innovation in the area. So the scheme sort of sat on the pier here. It was a really long sort of linear production line. You had this sort of harvesting tower out at sea, and then the seaweed travelled back to shore along these large sort of like lines, and then into the sort of processing factory. And obviously there was a lot of research in sort of how seaweed grows, and there's the three main methods. Off-bottom harvesting, which basically happens at intertidal waters, which is where it's kind of like beachy. And the seaweed here is just like put onto posts and hung. Raft harvesting happens in subtidal waters, so a little bit deeper. It's hung over these nets. And then long line harvesting is in really deep waters. You have these like buoys that have these long lines, and that's sort of what you would think of when you think of seaweed, the really long like bits of kelp. And then to go along with that, I designed these sort of three harvesting vessels that had sort of different characteristics that made it suitable for the harvesting type that I responded to. So this was just some more research on seaweed. This was like a taxonomy that I produced from site. So I went to the site and collected loads of seaweed. Each type had sort of different, you can get like green, brown and red algae, and they all have different characteristics. So this was an important sort of task to deduce sort of what was around and what it could be used for. And then here's just some drawings that I did on site of the specimen that I found. And then again, during research, I found a lot about this lady called Amelia Griffiths, who was like a 19th century pioneer of marine botany. She collected and collated loads of species of algae, and a lot of her works are basically like, that was like the foundation of this kind of marine botany. So a lot of her works are in the British Library and British museums, but due to her being a like scientist in the 19th century, she didn't really get credited for any of her work. So this then became, the project's called AGAR Lab, which stood for like the Amelia Griffiths Algae Research Lab. So it just kind of celebrated her discoveries and set to sort of unite all of her specimen like under one roof for viewing. So then as a bit of a pilot scheme, I developed this bioplastic process. So these are just some swatches that I made out of different specimens that I'd collected on site. So it's basically going and foraging the seaweed. I would then like boil it down to get the extract, and then basically you like cook it and let it dry. And they all had different qualities. I also experimented with mixing the sort of pigment into paint. Had this kind of seaweed paint that I used on some of my like site maps, and then also made some kind of seaweedy leather sort of material, which is similar to, you can make like leather from kombucha. It's basically like you have a vat of the liquid, and then it sort of ferments, and it has like this layer on the top that becomes quite flexible. So these are just some elevation studies of the different buildings that sit along that sort of linear production line. So I'll start here, the factory. you can see here there's like this external rail system, which was like a system that the seaweed specimen travelled on to the specific parts of the site. And the facade was actually constructed out of eelgrass that was harvested on site. And this was sort of a modern interpretation on a traditional building typology in Denmark, where they have these eelgrass thatched roofs. So I'd studied that and sort of combined it with modern technologies that we have now. This was sort of a machine hall with, again, like eelgrass paneling on these inserts. Within this area, there was the Amelia Griffiths sort of library and like machines that process the seaweed, sort of drying it and then picking it between green, red and brown as they went to sort of different parts of the site. The sorting house, this was like an existing, on the right here, an existing sort of warehouse. Again, these sort of cranes that I was looking at, I was looking back towards sort of mining. I was trying to bring that kind of typology in. So basically this controls these lines, and when the scheme wasn't in operation, sort of when seaweed was out of harvest, it's like this big, the crane sort of controlled the roof, and as the roof lifted, the reel sort of reeled the seaweed into the machine hall. There's then this sort of pier structure that projected out into the sea that provided sort of a walkway for members of the community to tend to like ocean allotments. The idea was that they could fish off it, or they could have sort of mussels. They sit in these like basket things that they could tend to. And then overhead you see the sort of harvest rails reeling the algae produce back in. And then finally, the furthest out at sea was this harvest tower. The idea was that sort of research groups would come here, because during my research I found quite a lot of other groups that were looking at this. One example, I think they're called like ULA, they did the water for the London Marathon. It was like to get rid of plastic bottles, they had these like little water capsules that were in, it was seaweed, it was like a seaweed polymer that you just bit into, and it was biodegradable. So the idea was that this would kind of be an area where places like that could come, and you know they knew they would have access to produce to sort of experiment and research with. And this is just some renders, one of the sort of harvest pier with like a member of the community sort of reeling up a line of seaweed. And then this was a render of the sort of interior of the factory. So you just see some sort of scientists working in the background, seaweed sort of travelling along a conveyor belt, and then some other areas where it's drying. And then yeah, just a quick floor plan of the two factories that ran alongside each other. So this area in the middle is where the render on the first page was taken from. So there's the two factories running down the side. The idea was this was like an open sort of market where people could come and shop seaweed, or there'd be little like food stalls selling seaweed produce. And then on the right here is the tech axle of the seaweed sort of facade build-up that I was talking about. So basically the eelgrass is dried and stored in these like vasks, which is just these big like rope, almost like eelgrass sausages, like dried. And then this was inserted into like a timber system, and then it was also used inside the walls as insulation. Because it's so salty off-grown in the sea, it's like antimicrobial and fire resistant just because of the high salt content. No bugs really go there, and also it's really hard to set alight because of its high saline content. And then it also had a similar, I tested the U value, and it also has similar properties to sort of mineral wool insulation. So as a natural building type, it worked pretty well. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone.